They don't teach you that the person who loves you most can become a stranger overnight. And they definitely don't teach you what to do when the stranger is someone you raised. I built my company with my hands. Not metaphorically. I mean, I actually poured the foundation of the first warehouse myself back in 1987 when I was 31 years old and my knees still cooperated. 42 years in commercial refrigeration. Not glamorous, I know. Nobody puts cold storage logistics on an inspirational poster. But it paid for my son's braces, his car at 16, his college tuition, and the wedding he threw for himself and his wife that cost more than my first house. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63, I have a bad hip, and 6 months ago my son served me eviction papers in the kitchen I'd remodeled twice. He was holding a glass of scotch when he did it. Not even good scotch, the kind people buy to impress other people. I should back up. After my wife passed, that was 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to gone. I rattled around in our house in Tucson for about 8 months before my son called and said I should come live with him and his wife in Phoenix. He had the space, a 5-bedroom new construction in a gated community, the kind with a fountain at the entrance that runs even during drought restrictions. I thought he was being kind. I thought a lot of things back then that turned out to be wrong. His wife, I'll call her what she is, my daughter-in-law, had been polite to me at the funeral. She cried at the right moments. She held my hand during the burial. But somewhere between Tucson and Phoenix, something shifted. By the time I carried my second box through their front door, I could feel it. The way she smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. The way she referred to my boxes as the situation in the guest room. Small things, the kind of things you notice when you spent 40 years reading people across a negotiating table. My son saw none of it, or he chose not to. I was never sure which. I tried to make myself useful. I cooked breakfast on weekends. I handled the yard when their landscaping crew cancelled. When their furnace made a noise last January that the HVAC technician quoted $4,000 to fix, I spent an afternoon with a flashlight and a YouTube video and fixed it for the cost of a $30 part. My son thanked me. My daughter-in-law pointed out that I'd left a grease mark on the utility room wall. The thing about living in someone else's house, even your own child's house, is that you're always a guest. You can be the best guest in the world, helpful and quiet and grateful, and you're still a guest. You can feel it in small ways. The way conversation stops when you enter a room, the way certain decisions get made, and you're informed rather than consulted. The way your coffee mug somehow ends up at the back of the cabinet behind mugs you've never seen anyone use. My son worked in finance. He'd gotten an MBA from the University of Arizona, which he was proud of, and he'd done well for himself. A director title, a good salary, the right zip code. He was sharp with numbers and completely comfortable making decisions about things he only partially understood. I recognized it as a professional trait. I'd seen it in vendors my whole career. The confidence of someone who knows enough to feel certain but not enough to be right. That confidence is what got us here. About 8 months after I moved in, my accountant, a man I'd worked with for 22 years, called me to discuss updating my estate documents. He was in Scottsdale, not far. We had lunch. It was a routine conversation, the kind you have at my age when you've accumulated enough that it matters who gets it and how. We talked through a few scenarios. I left with some paperwork to review. I made the mistake of mentioning it at dinner that night. Not specifics, just that I'd had lunch with my accountant and was thinking about updating some things. My son asked what kind of things. I said the usual, estate planning, nothing dramatic. He nodded in a way that meant he was filing it away. Looking back, that was the moment the clock started. Over the next few weeks, I noticed him watching me differently. Not rudely, he was never openly rude. I'll give him that, but with a kind of attention that felt more like calculation than concern. He started asking questions about my business, Had I ever thought about selling the remaining warehouse lease? What did I think the equipment inventory was worth these days? Wasn't it a lot to manage all that at my age? I told him the business was structured, that I had a manager who'd been with me 15 years and ran the day-to-day, that I checked in weekly, but I wasn't exactly chasing forklifts around at 63. He said that sounded tiring. I said it wasn't. Then my daughter-in-law started a new habit. She began referring to me, in conversations I was present for, as someone in a transitional period, as in, given where Dad is in his transition, maybe we should think about. She said it the way people say, given his condition, without wanting to say the actual condition. I let it go the first few times. Then I stopped letting it go, and started listening more carefully. The paperwork I'd left on the desk in the guest room disappeared one afternoon while I was at a doctor's appointment. I noticed it when I came back. My reading glasses were exactly where I'd left them. But the folder was gone. I didn't say anything. I went to the office supply store the next morning and bought a small lockbox. $12. I put everything in it and kept it in my duffel bag in the closet. It's a particular kind of grief, suspecting your own child. 2 months later, my son sat me down on a Sunday morning, his wife conspicuously absent, which told me she knew what was coming, and told me he'd had a conversation with an estate attorney. Not my attorney. His. He'd apparently had some concerns about how my assets were structured, whether I had the right protections in place, whether I'd considered the tax implications of various scenarios. He said this like he was doing me a favor. He slid a folder across the kitchen table. Inside was a draft document, a revised structure that would place my primary assets, including the business, into a family trust, managed jointly, meaning managed with his signature required alongside mine. I looked at the folder for a long time. Then I looked at my son. He had the expression of someone who believes they've been very clever, the expression of someone who has rehearsed this conversation and feels good about how it's going. I closed the folder and said I'd have my attorney look at it. He said he thought we could handle it without involving outside attorneys. I said I'd have my attorney look at it. He dropped it. For that day. That night I called my accountant from the guest room with the door shut and the fan running. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should call Roy." Roy was my estate attorney. He'd drawn up my original documents 11 years ago. I'd updated them after my wife's diagnosis and again after she passed. He knew my situation completely. I called Roy the next morning from a coffee shop 3 miles away. We talked for an hour. I told him everything. The folder, the questions about the business, the missing paperwork, the transition language. Roy is not an excitable man. He's 68, has been doing this for 35 years, and speaks in the measured tone of someone who has seen every version of this story. But at the end of the call, he said, "I think you already know what you need to do." I did. It took me 4 weeks to arrange it. I was careful. I didn't change my behavior at the house. I had breakfast with my son on Saturday mornings. I watched football with him on Sundays. I helped his wife carry groceries in from the car and thanked her for cooking when she cooked. I was exactly who I had always been, because I had nothing to hide and no reason to act otherwise. But I was working, quietly, in the background. I updated my estate documents completely. Roy drafted them. My accountant reviewed them. A third attorney I'd never used before notarized them in his office in Mesa on a Tuesday afternoon. I restructured the business ownership into an LLC with a designated succession plan that had nothing to do with joint management. I moved my personal accounts to a bank my son didn't know I used. I set up a small apartment, month to month, nothing fancy, in a building near my accountant's office in Scottsdale, just in case. I did not tell my son any of this. 2 weeks after the notarization, he found the document. Not the new one. An old one. The version from 4 years ago, the one I'd left in a manila folder in a box I hadn't fully unpacked when I moved in, buried under some tax records from 2019. He found it, and I want you to understand what that means. That he found it, which means he went through my things, and he read it. It was outdated. It was the version that named him as the primary beneficiary of everything, drafted before certain conversations I'd had with Roy about family dynamics and appropriate structures. It reflected a simpler time. My son apparently believed it was current. I know this because of what happened on a Thursday evening in March. I came home from a doctor's appointment, routine, a follow-up on my hip, and there were 2 cars in the driveway I didn't recognize. I walked into the house and found my son, my daughter-in-law, and 2 people I'd never seen before, sitting in the living room. The 2 strangers turned out to be a real estate agent, and, I would later learn, a contractor my daughter-in-law had apparently contacted to discuss renovation potential. My son stood up when I came in. He was holding that glass of scotch. He had the air of someone who has been waiting and is pleased the moment has finally arrived. He said they'd been talking, he and his wife, and they'd decided it would be best. For everyone, he emphasized, for everyone, if I found my own place. He said Phoenix had some very nice senior living options. He mentioned one by name. He'd apparently already looked into it. Then his wife said she thought it would be better for my health too, less stress. A community where I'd have people my own age. I stood in the doorway of a house I had never owned, being redirected to assisted living by my son and his wife, while a real estate agent I'd never met sat on the couch and studied her phone. I looked at my son for a long moment. He looked back with the expression of someone who believes the paperwork is already handled. I said, "Let me get some things from my room." I went to the guest room. I picked up my duffel bag, which had been packed, not fully, but meaningfully, for about a week. I picked up the lockbox. I took my jacket from the chair. I looked around the room. The wedding photo of me and my wife that I'd set on the dresser when I moved in, I took that too. Then I walked back to the living room. My son was explaining something to the real estate agent. He stopped when I came in. I set my key to the house on the coffee table. I said, "The furnace filter needs to be changed in about 6 weeks. There's a spare in the utility closet, top shelf." My son stared at me. I said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." Then I walked out. I sat in my car in the driveway for about 2 minutes. Not because I was upset, or not only because I was upset, but because I wanted to feel the full weight of the moment before I drove away from it. 42 years of working, 31 years of fatherhood. And this was the shape of it, a coffee table with a key on it. A real estate agent on the couch. Then I drove to Scottsdale. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a window that looked out at a parking structure. It was nothing like my house in Tucson or the 5-bedroom in Phoenix, but it was mine. I made coffee at 11 at night and I didn't worry about the sound of the grinder waking anyone up. Roy called me 2 days later, not because anything was urgent, but because he'd heard from my son's attorney. Apparently, my son had contacted an estate attorney, a different one than the one who drafted the folder he'd shown me to begin the process of, as Roy put it, managing the transition of assets. He had submitted a copy of the document he'd found in my box. The 2021 version. Roy told me this with the same measured tone he used for everything. Then he said, "Would you like me to schedule a call with his attorney?" I said yes. That call happened on a Monday morning. My son's attorney was a youngish man who spoke with a great deal of confidence. He laid out his understanding of the estate document, the named beneficiary structures, the timeline for various proceedings. He spoke for about 6 minutes without interruption. Then Roy said, "I'd like to share a document with you." He sent it during the call, the 2024 version. The one notarized in Mesa on a Tuesday in February. There was a pause. The other attorney asked a clarifying question. Roy answered it. There was a longer pause. I said nothing. I had nothing to add. My son called me that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. He called again that evening. I listened to the voicemail. He did not apologize. He said we needed to talk. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said his wife had perhaps jumped ahead of things and he hadn't fully, he used the phrase, hadn't fully processed all the implications. I called him back the next morning. I let him talk for a while. He circled around the apology without landing on it. He mentioned the senior living facility again, briefly, then seemed to realize that was a mistake and changed the subject. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. He asked where I was staying. I told him Scottsdale. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. Then he asked, and this is the part I'll remember for the rest of my life, he asked if there was any way to revisit the estate structure, just to discuss it, just to understand my thinking. I said, I think you understand my thinking pretty well. He didn't have an answer for that. What I hadn't told him, what I hadn't told anyone because it wasn't yet relevant, was the rest of it. For 31 years, alongside running a commercial refrigeration business, I had been doing something else. Something I never talked about at dinner parties or school events or evidently in front of my son. Starting in my early 30s, I had been quietly investing, not in stocks. I never trusted things I couldn't see. I invested in real estate, small properties, then larger ones. A duplex in Tucson, a strip mall in Mesa, a storage facility in Chandler that I bought from a retiring owner for a song in 2003 and which had appreciated in ways that still surprised me. I'd also invested in 3 early-stage businesses over the years. Small amounts, $10,000 to $30,000 each, 2 of which had failed and 1 of which had not. That last one was a software company started by a friend's son in 2009. I put in $22,000 and took a small equity stake. They sold to a larger firm in 2019. None of this was secret exactly. It was simply that I had never discussed my finances with my son in any real detail, because I'd raised him to understand that a man's finances were his own business until he chose to make them otherwise. The total picture, as of last year, was considerably more than what the 2021 document reflected. Not because the document was wrong, but because that document only covered what I'd considered my primary estate at the time. The investment properties were in a separate LLC. The software company payout had been rolled into a trust that predated the 2021 document entirely. My son had found one folder. He had assumed it was the complete picture. It was not close to the complete picture. Roy sent the full accounting to my son's attorney at my instruction. Not to be cruel. That was not the point. The point was that if there was going to be a legal discussion about my estate, the discussion should be based on accurate information. My son's attorney apparently shared this with my son. My son called me that weekend. This time the call was different. He was quieter. The efficiency was gone. He asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a place near his office. He arrived before me, which was unusual. He was already sitting when I walked in, and he looked, for the first time in a long time, like he was not entirely sure of himself. He apologized. A real apology, not the circling kind from the previous week, but the kind where someone looks at the table first and then looks up at you. He said he hadn't understood. He said he hadn't understood. He said he'd let his wife's anxiety about the future push him into decisions he wasn't proud of. He said he knew that didn't excuse it. I listened. Then I said something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I told him that his mother and I had always planned to take care of him. That it had never been a question, but that being taken care of and taking over were 2 different things, and he had confused them. I told him that the worst thing he had done wasn't the attorney or the document or even the eviction. The worst thing was that he had looked at me, his father, the man who poured that first foundation at 31 years old, and he had seen an obstacle instead of a person. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. Again, just that. I told him I wasn't interested in cutting him off. I wasn't interested in retaliation or punishment or making him feel small. I was interested in whether he was someone I could trust. That was the only question that mattered to me now. He asked what that would look like. I told him I didn't know yet, but we'd figure it out slowly, the same way you figure out most things worth figuring out. We finished our coffee. He paid. It wasn't a resolution, those take longer than a single cup of coffee, but it was a beginning of something that might become one. I drove back to Scottsdale. The parking structure was still outside my window. The apartment was still small. But I'd slept well in it every night since I moved in, and I slept well again that night, and the night after that. My accountant asked me once, a few years ago, why I'd never made a bigger show of what I'd built, why I didn't have a nicer car, a bigger house, more of the visible markers. I told him what my father had told me a long time ago, standing in a cold garage in December, teaching me how to winterize a commercial cooling unit when I was 16 years old. The people who talk the most about what they have are usually the ones who are least sure they deserve it. I think about that a lot these days, about what we build and what we reveal, and how the timing of one shapes the meaning of the other. The key is still on my keychain, not the one to my son's house. I left that on the coffee table. But the one to the storage unit in Chandler, which I've had since 2003, which I've never lost, which opens a door to something my son never thought to ask about. That's the thing about quiet work. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates year after year, until one day someone opens a door they thought was theirs and finds out it goes somewhere they never expected. I've thought a lot about that key, the one I left on the coffee table before I walked out. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. I'm not a dramatic man. It was just the practical thing to do. I didn't need it anymore, and leaving it felt cleaner than pocketing it and mailing it back later. But the more I think about it, the more I think that key is the whole story. My son found a folder in a box I hadn't finished unpacking. He read it, decided he understood the full picture, and started moving pieces around a board he thought he owned. He was wrong about the folder. He was wrong about the board. But more than anything, he was wrong about me, about what I'd spent 40 years quietly building, and, more importantly, about what kind of man I am. That's not a failure of intelligence. My son is intelligent. He has an MBA and a good job, and he can read a balance sheet faster than most people I've worked with. The failure was something different. It was a failure of character. The slow, invisible kind that doesn't show up until there's money on the table and a decision to make. He chose to go through my belongings. He chose not to ask me directly. He chose to involve attorneys before he ever sat down and had an honest conversation with his father. Each of those choices told me something, and none of it was about his IQ. What I keep coming back to is this. Integrity isn't something you perform when people are watching. It's what you do when you think no one is. My son thought I was just an old man with a hip problem and an outdated document in a cardboard box. He acted accordingly. What he didn't account for was that I'd been paying attention my whole life, to people, to details, to the slow accumulation of decisions that either build something or quietly hollow it out. The same quality that made me get up at 5 in the morning to pour a foundation in 1987 is the same quality that made me call Roy from a coffee shop 3 miles away. Not panic, not revenge, just the steady, unglamorous work of handling things correctly, one step at a time. You don't build 40 years of anything without learning that most problems are solved by showing up, thinking clearly, and refusing to cut corners even when no one would know. I don't tell this story to make my son look bad. He's still my son. We're still figuring out what trust looks like now. Slowly, the way you have to. But I tell it because I think a lot of people my age know this particular kind of hurt. The moment you realize someone you raised looked at you and saw a transaction instead of a person, and I want those people to know that the answer isn't bitterness. The answer is exactly what you've always done. Keep your record straight, know your own worth, and don't let anyone else define the terms of your life. The storage unit in Chandler is still there. I drove by it last week. Same key, same lock, same building I bought from a tired man in 2003 who just wanted to be done with it. Quiet work. Unglamorous. Accumulated. That's all it ever was. That's all it needed to be.